Thanks, guys, for the introductions. That was really good. I'm so happy to be here at Villanova to talk about this book, Heat and Light. This is a real Pennsylvania book. As we talked about today in class, the sort of galvanizing event for this story is natural gas drilling and the controversy over fracking in Pennsylvania. But the book is in fact much larger than that. It's really a book about our hunger for energy. Some might even call it our addiction to energy, and how this influences our economies, our communities, our lives. This book goes all over the place. It's a contemporary story that dips into the past from time to time. And one of those journeys into the past is to 1979, before you guys were born, to the time of the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, not so far from here. I remember this event. I was a child when this happened, and it's something that has haunted me for years. It was a terrifying moment. Nobody understood quite what was happening, children or adults. And I knew for a long time that I would someday have to write about this. I didn't realize I was going to write about it in this book, but that's exactly what happened. So I'm going to read to you from this middle section of the book, set in 1979. This section is called Normal Accidents. It is a work of genius, alive as a human body, the dream of a scientist with the intellect of God. But the scientist himself did not design it. The engineers who designed it have never run it. The operators can't themselves maintain it. The maintenance crew has no idea what they're maintaining. They perform procedures outlined in the handbook written by someone. They follow the schedule and complete the checklist and hang the yellow tag. The miracle sits on an island at a bend in the river 3 miles downstream from the town. A generation ago, vacation cabins were built here. Farmers grew corn and tomatoes and sent the harvest to the capital by barge. Unit 1 came online 5 years ago, a good time for a miracle. Cars idling for hours at the Pennzoil, the president kicked out of the White House, Patty Hearst pointing a machine gun in her communist beret. Today, Unit 1 is down for refueling. Unit 2 has been online just 3 months. For 5 weeks, it has run at full capacity, powering schools and hospitals, factories and airports, the utility recouping its investment. Unit 2 cost $700 million. Miracles are not free. The plant has uncountable moving parts, God's wristwatch, acres of tanks and engines and pumps and chambers, variously heating and cooling, humming and spinning, each calibrated for its single mission, the unique and infinitesimally precise action, the step, turn, dip in the dance. Miles of piping, a small city of valves opening and closing. 1,000 parts for each symbol in the equation, a declarative sentence in a wordless language no one actually understands. In the containment building stands the reactor, 40 feet high and 15 across, a massive cylinder of reinforced steel. The reactor is the Ark of the Covenant, a receptacle of high purpose. Inside is the uranium core. The core contains fuel rods, 100 tons worth, 36,000 tubes coated with zircon cladding, each packed with radioactive pellets. The core generates a lunatic heat. Water runs constantly through it. The water turns to steam and is piped to a generator, which powers a turbine, which runs to a generator, which feeds a transformer, which connects to the grid. The grid powers televisions in 3 states, 8-track tape players and weed whackers, the wherever popcorn pumper, the Atari 5600 game console. The plant is self-regulating, entirely self-sufficient. The lobster shift runs 11 to 7. 2 night operators man the controls. The control room is large as an auditorium, bright as an operating theater. The panels add extra illumination, red lights, blue lights, white, green, gold. The panels cover 3 walls, floor to ceiling. Altogether, there are 900 square feet of buttons and switches and dials and gauges, tracking each shiver in the system. All in the service of the equation, the wordless sentence, the numeric koan in the secret language of God. Of the 6,000 indicators in the control panel, 750 are alarms. An hour before dawn, the 2 night operators drink coffee and talk about the movie. One has seen it, one has not. Pure horse shit, says the first man. Looks real, though, the instrumentation and all. The movie, about a disaster at a nuclear plant, opened 12 days ago. He saw it with his wife, who clutched his arm in rapt and fluttering fascination. Is it really like that? Showing for the first time in years an interest in his work, in him period, the familiar husband transformed into something larger than he'd been that morning, the chronic snorer in a stained undershirt, the bathroom slob. Yeah, pretty much. He felt a rush of manful pride, as though he'd taken her for a spin in a sports car. I wonder where they filmed it, says the second man. What kind of a plan would let them do that? The alarm lights run across the top of the back panel, 750 glass windows, each 3 by 5 inches. When a window illuminates, a message is displayed. Pressurizer low, coolant pump vibration high. The panes are lettered in block capitals like Valentine candy hearts. If an alarm trips, the light flashes off and on until the problem is acknowledged. Then it glows steadily until the issue is resolved. The plant is self-regulating, entirely self-sufficient. Its marvelous autonomy is the central tenet of the handbook. The maintenance crew knows otherwise, the 16 men in constant motion. That Wednesday morning in the turbine room, a tech services a feedwater polisher. The feedwater system cools the reactor. It also owns his soul. To the feedwater system, he is a whore on retainer. He services each tank and pump without favoritism, diligent, quietly hostile, a slave to the collective need. The turbine room is dark and noisy, ribbed with piping. His client at the moment is Polisher 4, also known as a demineralizer, also known as an ion exchange tank. This fucker has aliases like a master criminal, wanted in all 50 states. There are 8 such polishers, each filled with resin beads to scrub the feed water. The beads are changed every 28 days exactly, as outlined in the handbook. The handbook weighs 9.5 pounds. The equation is vision and hallucination, dreamed by wizards who can't change a tire. He'd pay good money to watch them unclog a feedwater polisher, a hulking piece of junk that clots regularly in menstrual fashion, the fucking thing worth more than his car probably, and yet. Changing the beads is an arduous process. At one time or another, each of the polishers has clogged. The tech flushes them with water and compressed air as directed by the handbook. This works only sometimes. At 4 a.m., the shift foreman comes downstairs to help. He clambers up on a pipe and peers through a sight glass. He's getting too old for this. For a brief second, the pipe quivers beneath him. He recoils instinctively, just as the pipe lurches free of its mounting. The noise is deafening, like a massive engine backfiring. Water races through the compressed airline in machine gun bursts. The feedwater valves are controlled pneumatically. A second later, every valve in the system slams shut. Upstairs, the control room quakes like a plane caught in turbulence. The 2 night operators are shaken from their chairs. It is 37 seconds past 4 a.m. A siren wails like a cat set on fire. All across the back panel, the white lights are flashing. The night operators are startled but not worried. There are systems in place for such eventualities, for all eventualities. In every situation imaginable, the plant itself knows what to do. There are 1,000 parts for each symbol in the equation, a declarative sentence in a wordless language no one need understand. In a matter of seconds, the plant itself takes action. First, the turbine shuts down. The bypass valves open, dumping steam into the condenser, circumventing the turbine. This series of events is described in the handbook, an article of faith. Then, for inscrutable reasons, the reactor itself shuts down. The operators stare in disbelief. All around them, the panels are flashing like fireworks, red lights, blue lights, green, yellow, gold. In training drills, systems fail one at a time. There's never a question where to focus. But now, the turbine is tripped. The reactor has tripped. The feedwater system has shut down completely. Temperature and pressure are rising. The operators are surrounded by flashing lights above and below and behind them. The shift supervisor makes an announcement over the PA as directed by the handbook. Unit 2, turbine trip, reactor trip. Years ago in the Navy, he ran a submarine reactor. He repeats it twice for good measure, his voice strong and confident, militarily gruff. One after another, safety systems activate. Relief valve, makeup pumps, injection pumps. These devices act automatically at the precise right moment. The handbook decrees it so. 15,000 people live within a mile of the plant. They have seen the miracle only from a distance, the 4 cement cooling towers, massive and bell-shaped, exhaling steam. To the 15,000, the thing has not yet happened. Showers are taken, breakfasts eaten, the Remington electric shaver, the Amana Touch radar range. A feed salesman is driving to work, the plant visible in his rear view. He notes absently that no steam rises from the towers. Then he blows his nose and takes a Dristan. His son brought home a cold, from where the salesman can't imagine. The kid is homeschooled, shy of the neighborhood children. Left to his own devices, he would never leave the house. This morning is no different. The boy, Wesley Peacock, plays a board game in his pajamas, cross-legged on the living room floor. The game involves building a complicated mousetrap, a Rube Goldberg-like contraption. There are 23 plastic parts in red, blue, green, and gold. He rolls the die and lands on a white space, then adds the plastic crank to the trap. The box says 2 to 4 players, but the clever only child learns to ignore such instructions. Wesley takes a turn for the blue mouse, a turn for the green one. He's used to playing against himself. It's fun to build this comical wonder, but woe to the mouse who gets caught under for ages 8 to 14, says the box. In the control room, several things are happening, all impossible. The emergency pumps have started, yet the temperature keeps rising. The temperature is rising, yet a white light flashes, pressurizer low. The pressure is dropping, yet a white light flashes, pressurizer water level high. According to the handbook, these things cannot happen. Either the instruments are lying or the handbook is full of shit. In the pump house building, a tech stares at a drain in the floor. A second later, he hears a smack of footsteps, the radiation chemistry tech running down the hall. "Get the hell out," he screams. "Get your stuff and get out." Still the water keeps coming, welling up through the drain in the floor. In the control room, men crowd in shoulder to shoulder, aftershave and coffee breath and sharp apocrine sweat, each other's personal smells. What is remembered? The base workings of the limbic brain, the black box recorder always running, taste, touch, smell, hearing, the substance of felt life. Years from now, when the day's events have been deconstructed and debated and reduced to a caption, this data will be missing from the record, the human texture the photographs will not convey. Across the panel, lights of all colors are now flashing. Ominous realities are becoming clear. Steam has overflowed the quench tank. The containment building is flooded with reactor water. In the dome of the building, radiation levels are skyrocketing. Radioactive water seeps into the pump house building, rising up through the drains in the floor. From the ship's supervisor's office, phone calls are made per the handbook. First things first, the American Nuclear Insurers Company. Next, the state police, the county civil defense, the Pennsylvania Bureau of Radiological Health. The final call is to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, its regional office in the Philadelphia suburbs. The line rings and rings. At last, the supervisor leaves a message on an answering machine. No one is there to pick up the phone. So that's from the kind of center part of the book, one of those digressions into the past. I'm happy to answer any questions about this book or about any of my earlier books, questions about being a writer or about the writing process, any of that stuff. Yes?
How long did it take you to research 3 Mile Island to write that kind of?
Forever. It made me understand how much I really comprehended about nuclear energy. Almost nothing when I started writing this book. So I really had to do this kind of remedial self-education, just even to know what questions to ask. I love writing about machines, can you tell? I'm very interested in machines, and this to me was like 6 months of my life where all I read or thought or wrote about was 3 Mile Island. And in an odd way, it is kind of a digression in this book because most of the story happens in the present day. But this trip into the past completely captured my imagination. Yeah.
I have a question along the same lines of, actually, I do research in fracking communities, and you nailed it. You got what those people are experiencing. So how did you get that? How did you get? I mean, it's so raw, and that's what you got.
Well, thank you for that. That means a lot to me. I did a tremendous amount of research to write this book. I spent about 5 years on this book, both writing and researching, which doesn't sound as long as it is. But I got to tell you, in that time, I did not write a single book review. I didn't teach a class. I don't have kids. I didn't go on vacation. I did nothing but write this book for 5 years. So it really is an Herculean effort. A lot of that research had to do with what life is like in a town when fracking happens. I spent a lot of time tracking down people who had firsthand experience of this and just listening to their impressions. I talked to people who had leased their mineral rights and had had the experience of a drill rig 200 miles from the back door. I talked to other people who had decided against leasing their mineral rights and heard about some of their reasons. I talked to environmental activists who were concerned about groundwater issues. I talked to geologists. I talked to a lot of guys who work on drill rigs. I talked to people kind of on all sides of this conflict. And that was terribly important for me. I started writing this book having certain feelings about fracking. But as I learned more about the subject, I realized that I could not do justice to this story just talking to people who had leased their mineral rights. That's only one piece of the story. I wanted to look at how it affects the entire community, all the people who live there, and all the outsiders who come in because of this, all the drilling crews who come from Texas and Oklahoma, and all the activists who are desperately concerned about these problems and trying to organize the community. So it was just many, many, many conversations and a great education for me. Yeah.
So you wrote most of the book in the present tense, which is kind of coming into vogue nowadays, but there's also like a reaction against that. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, like what made your decision?
Yes, one point. The present tense is always either coming into vogue or going out of vogue. And there's always a reaction to whatever it's doing. So this continuum long predates me as a writer, and this argument will continue long after I'm dead, the question of using the present tense. I debated about using the present tense. I'd never done it before, written a whole novel in the present tense, and there are good arguments against it. It's something that I have at times cautioned students against doing, because it really is, it's not right for every story, and in some ways it does make your job harder. The reason I chose the present tense is that all of these characters are very much reacting to their circumstances and living in the moment. And nobody in this book really has a sense of the big picture. Nobody can kind of see the overview of where this situation is going. And that seemed to me psychologically true, based on the way people make decisions about this fracking controversy. The truth is, this is a very new technology. We understand almost nothing about the long-term consequences for the planet, for human health. There are a great many unanswered questions about this technology. So we are all kind of living in the present as we make decisions about this. So that's really what led me to the present tense. But I vacillated about it. I went back and forth. There are sections of the book I wrote several times, present tense, past tense, wrote with different point of view characters. It's that long, hideously inefficient process of writing a first draft where you just write yourself in circles.
So what about the present tense you think is difficult to write? How does it cause problems for you as a writer?
Well, a lot of stories are interesting because of what those events mean later. And when you write the story in the present tense, you are denying yourself a powerful tool as a writer. You don't get to use retrospection. We read lots of coming-of-age stories about very young characters that are narrated by people who are somewhat older. And the reason for that is that when a few years have passed, you can understand precisely what those experiences meant. You know what the consequences were. You know what all of that led to. But if you were just writing it in the moment, you don't have that luxury of reflection. And so it really ties your hands as a writer, and it limits what your fiction is able to do. It doesn't let you play with memory, which is one of the most interesting things about writing fiction, and one of the most powerful tools you have as a writer is to work with memory. So in most cases, as a general rule, I think the past tense is a better answer for writing a novel. This book seems to me to be an exception, but I may very well never again write a whole novel in the present tense. It's just this time it was what worked. Yeah.
You said that you hadn't planned on writing about 3 Mile Island in this book. Do you generally outline beforehand, or just go through a first draft and look back and see what worked within what it needs, or what's your general beginning writing plan?
The answer is yes, I do all those things, somewhat unsuccessfully. I do try to kind of plan ahead and think about what the shape of the novel is going to be, but I'm always wrong. Going into a first draft, my image of the novel I'm going to write bears almost no resemblance to the novel I end up writing. It changes dramatically in the course of several drafts. This book took 7 drafts, which is about average for me. A draft sometimes can take a year, can sometimes take a few months. So, I do try to think about the shape of the novel, the overall structure, but it's the sort of thing that I have to discover in the process of writing for the most part. We talked about this in class today. I'm very interested in the difference between plot and causality. There are certain kinds of fiction that are entirely plot-driven. I'm thinking of like mysteries and thrillers, stories that kind of run on suspense. To write one of those books, you really do need to know what happens. If you're writing a murder mystery, you really do need to know who committed the murder in order to write the story. So you do have to do a lot of figuring on the front end. The kind of fiction I'm writing is somewhat different in that it's very much character-driven. So what happens in the book is a function of who these people are. And I don't learn who they are until I've done some writing. So when I set out writing, I have these very cursory ideas of who the characters are. They're kind of stick figures. And it's in the process of writing chapters that the characters become three-dimensional, that they become like real human beings. And unfortunately, there's no more efficient way to get there except by writing some chapters. So invariably, my initial ideas about how these characters are going to behave, what they're going to do in the story, often turn out to be wrong because these people are quite different from my initial stick figure impression of them. They surprise me. So I do plan, and it's not as helpful as I wish it were. Yeah, in the back.
Was there any point in the process of writing this book where you felt like you hit
Oh my God, that is such a common occurrence. The question is about ever in the course of this book, did I feel like I hit a wall in the writing process? I live against a wall in the writing process. It is a constant companion. It happens all the time. You know, so much of writing is just showing up every day. And this was a lesson that took me a while to learn as a young writer. When I started writing fiction, I thought, well, you know, I need to be inspired to write. And if I'm not inspired, there's no point in even trying. I might as well just go to the beach. I'll try again tomorrow. Unfortunately, that's not exactly right. Over time, I've learned that there is very little correlation between how inspired I felt and the quality of what I ended up producing. So the unpleasant lesson is that you have to show up every day and do your work whether you feel inspired or not. It's very much like working at Home Depot. If you work at Home Depot and you show up when you're inspired, you're really not going to last there very long. And writing novels is entirely like that. It is so much about showing up. And it's unglamorous, it's unromantic, but you do have to do it. And if you're going to crash into the wall, you have to crash into the wall and try again tomorrow. You know, some days I write a paragraph and it takes me 4 or 5 hours to do it. And those are miserable days. Other days I write a paragraph and throw it away the next day because it's so terrible. That's an even worse day. So, you know, it's those days are just part of the writing process for me. I don't believe in writer's block. I believe that writing is simply hard. And if there are days when it's not hard, well, then you were very lucky you had such a day. But the default setting is for it to be really difficult. So, yes, many collisions with walls. Yeah.
You said in class that Dick Devlin came up in like a short story, and then in your first book about Dick. And is there something about the character that makes you want to go back to him?
Yeah, it's a good question. This is about a character who appears in all 3 of my Bakerton books. He has a very minor role in the first one, a bigger role in the second one, and in the third. The reason I return to this character is because he's an old guy and he's lived through a lot of interesting stuff. I really love writing about old people because you get a sense of how the world changes over time. This character, Dick Devlin, is in his 70s in this book, and he has seen so much change happen to this town. He's a witness to things that the younger characters didn't experience. So the reason I go back to him is because he's a good witness. He's a smart observer, and he's been there for a lot of the interesting parts of the Bakerton story. Yeah.
Do you force yourself to work for a set number of hours per day?
I do. I force myself to go to work every day. I have a writing studio. I don't even attempt to write at home. So I go to my writing studio every day, and when I'm writing the first draft, it's not a long day. I basically sit there for as long as I can stand it. And some days that's not very long, honestly. The first draft is murderously difficult for me, and it doesn't get any easier. I'm working on my 7th book, and the first draft is as hard as the first draft of my first novel. I believe there are 2 kinds of writers. There are people who like doing the first draft and hate revising, and people who dread the first draft and only like revising. I'm that second kind of writer. I love revising because even when your draft is a hot mess, you have something to fix. There's a problem to solve. The first draft is terrible because you're trying to make something out of nothing. It almost feels like a magic trick. And I find that often very paralyzing. But I do show up every day, and I do force myself to do it, although often what I'm doing in the first year or so, I'm not even writing pages of the book, I'm writing about the book. I'm writing things that I know will never appear in the novel. I'm writing little biographies of the characters just so I know, what they were like as children, what were they like as teenagers, who was Dick Devlin's first love, what was his first job, what was it like when he found out his father had died? Like just peak experiences of his life that may not actually appear in the book, but I need to know about this stuff in order to feel like I know this guy. The goal for me is to know these characters the way I know members of my own family. And by the time I get to the end of the writing process, I really do know them that well. I know much, much more about them than will ever appear in the book. It may seem wasteful and inefficient, and it is, but I have not found another way to write fully developed characters. Question? Yeah?
I think a lot of your works are set in places you like lived. Do you see yourself writing either a story, or maybe you have done this, a story or a novel set somewhere where you haven't spent a significant amount of time?
You know, I've never had the desire to do it. What happens to me usually is I fall in love with the plays. I live in Boston. I've lived there for about 15 years, and I've written a couple novels set there. And those books grew out of my fascination with Boston, the weirdness of Boston, the frustrations of living in Boston. So it's often the place is the thing that sparks my interest. It's the first ember of the story. And I don't know if it can work another way for me. Certainly there are writers who do that. I mean, think of all the sci-fi writers who are writing about places that don't exactly exist, but in their imaginations. So it's a legitimate way to work. Many people do it. I cannot say I myself have ever had the desire, though. Last summer I was working on another novel set in Boston. I had a pretty good start on it. And then I went to China for a few months. It was my first trip to China. I was in Shanghai in the fall for the semester. And I found it impossible to write about Boston when I was in Shanghai and having my senses bombarded by the experience of being in China for the first time. And I ended up starting something else that is set in China that I'm still writing away at. So it often happens to me that being inspired by a place leads to new writing. And it's why travel is terribly important for me as a writer. Yeah.
When you're writing, do you prefer to write out in a notebook or like just go straight to a laptop?
I do both. It really depends on the thing I'm writing. Sometimes writing by hand is very helpful because it loosens me up a little bit. It seems less serious than working at a keyboard. It feels like I'm just playing around. Also, it's more portable. You know, you can take a notebook with you anywhere. It doesn't matter if your battery dies. You know, it's versatile in that way too. So I do both. There are books of mine that were written almost entirely by hand. Baker Towers was one of those, and I can't say why in that case. I got into the habit of writing by hand, but I did for that book. Faith, I worked not at all by hand. And I could not tell you why it was so different. But, you know, what it comes down to is you're always trying to find a way to trick yourself into writing. And once you get comfortable and sort of blasé about a particular method, it's sometimes helpful to try something else just to shake yourself up. So I do kind of toggle back and forth between the two. Yeah.
What is the biggest piece of advice that you could give a young writer?
Oh, okay. Couple things. So I think the most important thing I would say is you should read every day and write every day. And by reading, I mean a very specific thing. You know, I don't just mean, you know, surfing the internet or looking at magazines or reading a cereal box. I mean, read the kind of thing that you want to write. So if you're a poet, you need to read poetry every day. If you're a fiction writer, you need to read fiction every day. Maybe not a lot, but something. And here's the second part of my advice. Write about what you read. Write about it in a writerly way. And by that I mean, think about what makes this good or what makes this bad. If you're reading a book you hate, it's important to write about why you hate it. Why is it unsatisfying? You know, why do these characters feel unreal to you? What's the problem with the dialogue? Why do you hate the ending? It's very useful for you as a writer to deconstruct why you respond to what you respond to. So reading about what you write is a really crucial part of it, and it should be a lifelong habit for you as writers. It's incredibly useful. And you can also steal so much from what you read. You know, when you're reading something that just knocks you out, that try to articulate to yourself what makes this so outstanding. Why do you love this book so much? And I think you can teach yourself so much about writing just by getting into this practice every day.
select what you read?
Oh, well, it varies according to where I'm at in my own work. When I am like doing a lot of research, as I did for this book, a certain amount of my reading time is spent on just getting information. You know, to learn how a nuclear reactor works, you got to read about nuclear reactors. I mean, none of this is satisfying to me in the way that reading a great novel is satisfying, but it's part of what I do. Certain stories I tell do demand this kind of factual grounding that I don't necessarily have. So sometimes I'm just reading for information. Right now, when I'm doing a lot of traveling, traveling around talking about heat and light, I have lots of downtime and lots of time on planes, and I really am reading novels. And this is one of the great rewards of publishing, is that you're doing all this travel and you rediscover your love of reading. What happens to me typically when I'm working on a novel is that I find 1 or 2 or 3 books that turn out to be touchstones for that particular project. That sometimes it's the way the story is structured or the voice of it, but there's something in this particular book that inspires me in the project I'm working on. And it changes from book to book. It's never been the same reading list twice. When I was writing Baker Towers, the book I fixated on was William Styron's novel Lie Down in Darkness. And I don't know how many times I read that novel in the years I was writing Baker Towers. I mean, I may have read it 5 times. It was the book I kept on my bedside table. It was the book I took with me everywhere. And I really would not have written that novel had I not been struck by Styron's novel. And yet, superficially, my book bears very little resemblance to his book, so I can't exactly explain how that works. But it has to do with this feeling like you have a guide through the process. So much of what's difficult about writing a novel is that there are no rules. You're kind of working without any guidelines, and so to have 1 or 2 or 3 books that inspire you in a reliable way is very helpful. So that when I'm in a writing stage, I'm probably reading and rereading the 1 or 2 or 3 books that have inspired me for that project. But I also read a tremendous amount of poetry, and this is something I really recommend to prose writers. We don't do enough of it. And it really does shame you into writing better sentences. When you look at the art poets lavish on a line, how glib we fiction writers can be in our prose, how lazy, how facile it can become. Reading poetry is the antidote to that. I try to read poetry every day. I keep poetry in my studio. Sometimes when I'm having one of those miserable writing days where my face is up against the wall, I stop and read poetry, and that's often helpful. Like a lot of you probably, I don't love all poetry. I don't understand all poetry. The trick is to find the poems you do love, to find the poets you do understand, and read those poets. And it's, for me, they're not the poets I was assigned to read in high school. I don't like very much of that poetry, but I've, as an adult, found other poets who really speak to me, and those are my go-to books. So that's an important part of my reading also. Yeah.
Throughout the novel, you were able to generate so much emotion between your characters. So I was just wondering, when you reached its end, was there any moment that really touched you, or you were sad to let go?
Oh God, so many. So the final piece of this book is kind of an epilogue. It's called Afterlife, and I don't even remember how many pages it came out to be in the printed book, because I still think in manuscript pages. But yeah, it's maybe 30 pages in the book, and every bit of that was painful to write, because I was very aware that this is my last look at each of these characters. This is the last time I get to spend with any of these people. And that was actually exquisitely painful, writing the final 30 pages of this book. I think because I had been in it for so long and been with these people for so long, it was unimaginable to me that a day would come when I didn't get up every day and write these characters and spend time with them. Yes?
Find it difficult to write about characters that are supposed to be
You know, it's a very good question. The question is, do I find it difficult to write about characters who are unlikable or you know, that the reader may dislike? No, I don't. The truth is, I have great affection for all these characters, even the ones who do some really terrible things. And this has been true for me as a writer from the very beginning in everything I've ever written. I've never written a character I hate. Part of it is I just don't want to spend time with such people. But also, it's that when you do get to know people from the inside out, as you do with your characters as a fiction writer, it becomes harder and harder to hate them because you understand why they are this way. I mean, some of the characters in this book really frustrated me. Several of them frustrated me almost all the time. But it's the kind of frustration you feel for people in your own family, where they make you crazy, but you totally get why they are this way. So once you have that intimacy with your characters, you know, it's impossible to dislike them, really. You can get frustrated, you can hate the things they do, you can despair for them, but you can't really hate them, not if you really understand them as people. Yeah?
Yeah, I was curious, who do you consider, if anyone at all, to be the protagonist of the story, to learn off of Paul Buchner's?
You know, it's funny. I mean, I think his answer is as good at anything I can come up with. What happened when I was writing it, what happened was each one of these characters became the protagonist for a minute. So in the moment I was writing about a particular character, even if it's sort of a minor character, that was the whole universe for me, was this character's world. That it's like being an actor, where you really do inhabit this character. You see the world through his eyes, you agree with him about everything, you adopt his opinions, his mannerisms, his you know, habits of speech. You take his side, at least for that period while you're writing him. Even though you know that a month from now you're going to be writing a different character who has entirely different opinions and would disagree with this character about everything. So it's really a kind of loyalty you feel when you write in a point of view. It's deep loyalty. You know, I think of writing a novel as an exercise in extreme empathy. Reading novels is like this too. I really believe that fiction is the best technology we have for getting inside another person's head. No one has invented a better way to do this. I mean, it is the ultimate virtual reality technology, where you really do see the world through somebody else's eyes. So, you know, in order to write fiction and to write characters that are real people, you have to have that kind of empathy. You have to be loyal to them at least for the time you're writing them, and be willing to see the whole world through their eyes.
One more question?
One more? Yeah.
I guess going off of that, what are you hoping that this book does for Pennsylvania?
You know, I haven't thought. The question is, what do I hope the book does for Pennsylvania and for the industry? You know, I did not write it with an agenda in that way. I guess what I wanted to do was show exactly how it is. I just want to show this is what it's like to have a drill rig 200 yards from your back door. You know, this is what it's like to be concerned about your community and trying to organize your community and to be convinced that your immediate environment is in danger. You know, this is what it's like to be a coal miner who's lost his job, who has not had any kind of economic stability in his family for an entire generation. It's what it's like to be him, to be faced with this choice between, you know, leasing your mineral rights or continuing down the path you're on. So it was just trying to do justice to people's experiences, whatever side of this argument they inhabit. This is not an anti-fracking screed. I mean, it does show, you know, very honestly, this is the stuff that happens when gas drilling happens. But the point is not to convince people that fracking is bad. It's to make people understand a little bit how other people think differently about it. You know, one of the things I have been struck by in this debate about fracking is the complete incomprehension people feel for the other side. That I talk to people who really think gas drilling is a godsend, that it's going to save Western Pennsylvania, and they have absolutely no patience for or interest in the environmental arguments against it. On the other side, I've talked to environmental activists who have absolutely no feeling for the difficult choice people are forced to make when they're in really difficult economic circumstances and they're offered this, what they perceive to be their one chance. So there's a lack of empathy the whole way around, and I think if this book does anything, it's to force the reader to look at this question from a bunch of different perspectives. All right then, thank you.